Hello, welcome to the video. This one's going to be on food and kind of agriculture leading into food. And so what we're starting with here is the food pyramid. And so this is our conventional um, daily recommendation for food. At least it was when I was growing up. And so if it's changed since then, I apologize. But I just kind of like the graphic to begin with. You can see kind of how the FDA has kind of categorized where we should be getting our food from, what types of foods we need. And this is what we're working with. So let's get into the actual lesson here. What is food security? And so food security is a good definition to be aware of, especially as we're talking developing countries. Food security is how every person in a given area has the daily access to enough nutritious food to have an active and healthy lifestyle. And so as you can see from the data here, that's not true in developing countries. About 1 in every 6 of them do not have that. And the root cause is food scarcity and poverty. The big problem with this is not, is there enough food in the world to feed everybody? It's how is it distributed? And we'll see that it's not very evenly distributed. And so these poor areas, the developing countries, do not receive a fair share of the food, while other regions, the developed countries, usually take more than their fair share. A key word to this is nutritious food. And so some people have too much food or more food than is required, but they're still malnourished because they don't have the nutritional requirements in their food to meet their body's needs. So malnourished, undernourished, 2 words to be aware of. A malnourished means you're missing that specific chemical component, be it a vitamin or a certain amount of protein. Usually you get impairments from this. And so some of the impairments that we see with malnourished people are stunted growth, meaning they don't grow as tall as they normally would. That's a pretty large one. Usually abnormally thin, blindness, hearing. Some of the less vital organs are going to start to fail through malnourishment if they don't get the proteins or vitamins they need. If you're undernourished, that means the calories are not there. And so undernourished is the worst case scenario, where there's not enough calories going in versus calories going out. And so it eventually would lead to death for the undernourished. And so you can see over here I listed the countries. Maybe be aware that India, China, especially India, are the big ones for malnourishment. And my next page should have some undernourished for you. So here's our percentage of population that are undernourished, meaning they do not require or do not get the number of calories to survive on a daily basis. This would be poor food security in these areas, and you can see most of this is sub-Saharan Africa. We've got some problem countries over here in Asia as well, but the majority of the problem lies in this developing region of the world, where these countries lack the food to support the people. And a lot of it is that distribution, food distribution. How can we move food from the developed areas into the developing areas and do so that it's cost effective, and that we are giving people what they need so they can survive. Here's caloric intake. I'm not going to spend a bunch of time on this slide, but notice again, we've got the same regions that are lacking the right amount of calories. And look at the numbers for some of these developed countries, more than 3,300 or between 29 and 33. So there's plenty of calories to go around. It's just not distributed wisely. So there's a couple different types of agriculture to be aware of. The first one that we'll talk about is subsistence or traditional agriculture, and then we'll go into industrial. And so subsistence requires human labor and draft animals. So this is kind of people power, power of the muscle in order to create this food or make the product. Industrial is going to rely on machines, right? So this would be our fossil fuels and tractors and all that cool stuff. But that's going to rely on those things more so than human powered. So let's talk about subsistence or traditional agriculture. This is kind of what our ancestors did here in the United States. We've kind of shifted more towards industrial, but it's still done in a lot of the developing world. And it's frequently a polyculture because the agriculture these people are farming have to last them throughout the year. And so if you're farming here, you need to grow enough food to survive to the next year. And so if you have something like corn, which grows throughout the summer and then gets harvested in the early fall, you're going to eat really well in the fall and probably into the winter. But you might start to run out of food come springtime before your corn has been planted, or summertime while you're waiting for your corn to grow. And so a polyculture, you can kind of stagger those crops and you can harvest something in between there. So something that would be great, maybe like cucumbers, right? Cucumbers usually get planted in the late winter, at least here in the United States, and they usually get harvested in February or April, or February through April. And so that would allow you to eat while you're waiting for your corn crop to come through. This type of agriculture usually relies on child labor, and so when we talk to population, one of the benefits of having a lot of kids is means you get a lot of hands on your farm. And so if you're a subsistence farmer, that's a really good thing for you because you can turn that labor into agriculture. And so we can even go to what's called intensive subsistence agriculture, and that would be kind of increasing the yields through intensive labor or intensive use of farm animals and giving you some extra to sell. So if you're growing corn and cucumbers, maybe you overplant the corn and you're able to get a little excess that you can sell and acquire some goods and services. Slash and burn is one type of this subsistence agriculture, very common in the developing regions, especially the tropical areas. And what you see here is we've got our tropical forest that's being cut and burned down to make new land that we can begin to farm. And typically this land is very low nutrients in the soil. You see all these trees and everything growing here. Our O horizon here would be very, very heavy. But as things get decomposed and nutrients deposited, there's so much life that they're instantly being reused. And when we burn them, we lose that stuff. You can see the smoke leaving here. There goes all your nitrogen, your former nitrates in the form of nitrous oxide. And there goes all your organic carbon in the form of CO2 and carbon monoxide. And so you lose a lot of that stuff. And so typically this land is very unproductive for 20 to 30 years following slash and burn. And so this is not the most ideal situation here, but these are the regions we see a lot of it in. Industrial agriculture. I love this picture for this topic. You can see just the vast difference between the traditional agriculture. Here we're relying on monoculture, and so we're specializing in one type of crop. You see out in front of these harvesters here, these are probably soybeans is my guess. These plants are just one variety. There's no multiple varieties, and we've got very specialized machines to harvest them. On top of that, we are also going to be using a significant amount of water inputs, right, through irrigation, significant fertilizers, and pesticides. This monoculture is very susceptible to nutrient depletion because they're using the same amount of nutrients each growing cycle, so we got to replace them somehow. Same thing with the pests. If you're a soybean eating pest, this is the world's largest golden corral for you, and you're going to go to town with you and all your family. And so we need some sort of pesticides to control them. Whereas the polyculture, if you have a soybean pest, well, you still got your corn, you got your cucumbers, you got whatever else you're growing that would not be as affected. I also have a picture here for industrial meat farming. We'll get more into that later, but this would be kind of the industrial agriculture version of meat production. So here's chickens grown in a chicken pen. The Green Revolution, there's been two of them. And so the first one, this is the 60s-ish, Cold War era, 1960s that is. And what we're doing here is we're trying to increase the yield without regard to the consequences. So at any cost, we're going to grow more plants to feed the people. And we got a large population boom here, so we need a lot of food to feed them. And so we did our monocultures and multi-cropping to the extreme. We've kind of perfected this. The specialization of maximizing what we can get out of the land. And we did that through fertilizers, pesticides, and water inputs to create these high yields without really regard to how they affected the environment. So if we had fertilizers or pesticides runoff, that's okay. The greater goal is to make more stuff. In the second one, now we're improving technologies, particularly to aid the developing world. And we've kind of realized recently here that they're falling behind, and the food scarcity in those regions is worrisome to people that care about that. And so we're trying to see what can we do to aid these areas produce more food. How can they do so? Because this method is not the best for the environment, and we've kind of become wise to that. And so we've done a couple things. One of them is dwarf varieties that excel in these tropical climates. And so if you check this out, this is dwarf rice. This is the regular rice on the left. Letter A is regular. Letter B is the dwarf variety. And so what we've essentially done is we've bred and crossbred rice plants to create a shorter version, a version that is going to produce rice more quickly, right? And so it goes from 130 days to mature as opposed to the normal 160. So you're getting it a whole month earlier. In addition to that, we were formerly getting a ton of rice per hectare of land because it's so tall and stocky like this, to now we're getting about 5 tons per hectare without any fertilizer, and we can push it to 10 if we use nitrogen fertilizers. And so you can see how much more dense and compact this smaller dwarf plant is. And so these have been really productive in that second green revolution to feed this growing, developing world. Where do we get our food from? And so there are about 250,000 plant species that produce some sort of fruit or nut, something we could eat from. Of those, we've tried, in human history, this is about 3,000 of them as crops. And about 300 of them we currently grow for food in decent quantities. About 100 of those are used on a large scale, right? So we're kind of narrowing down and down and down. It's kind of like a giant funnel here. And about 15 to 20 of them provide a vast majority. So it's really funneled down, and one of the concerns is how few species humankind relies on. And in fact, there is a big five, and those big five are right here: wheat, rice, corn, potatoes, and soybeans. Those 5 things alone are supplying the bulk of this 90%. And you can see just wheat and rice alone make up 60% of our caloric intake. And so where does the wheat and the rice come from? The wheat comes from China, India, Russia, USA, and Canada are our big suppliers of wheat. The rice, big suppliers are China, India, Indonesia, Vietnam, and Thailand. And so those are our kind of major farming agricultural capitals of the world, producing the bulk of our food supplies. One interesting note here is that it takes about 16 pounds of a grain to produce 1 pound of edible meat. That comes from the rule of 10%, remember? So the 10% of the energy in the grains, if you feed it to a chicken or to a cow, we lose the other 90% of that. Only 10% goes to producing the meat. And so it's very inefficient energy-wise to eat meats because you're losing a lot of that energy. One more step on the food pyramid. These are some other plants that we harvest in decent qualities for food sources. I'm not going to speak about them. Some types of crops, I just want to hit on this too. There are cash crops or subsistence crops. A cash crop is one that we are going to sell. It doesn't necessarily have to be a food product. Something like latex, of course, would not be a food product. Or it may not make up primary nutrition. So tea, this says coffee. Those don't make up primary parts of our nutrition. You can't survive on tea and coffee alone, but they're a valuable commodity, a valuable resource, and people really like them. And so you can sell it for a lot of money. Whereas subsistence crop, this is something like corn or something like wheat or soybeans or rice that we're selling for food or growing it to eat it, to make it food. And so this is the last part I'm going to leave you with, kind of the land use in the United States. And so this is how many acres are being harvested at the time that this graph was made in 2002 as a percent of the land. And so you can see where the intensive farming takes place, kind of out here in this Midwestern region. That's kind of the breadbasket of the United States. Corn, soybeans, that kind of stuff is all going to be grown out here in large amounts. And so 65% of the land in some of these darker regions is being used. Florida, we're pretty clean here in terms of land use for agriculture. It's not very productive soil. As you know, it's pretty sandy around here. This last graph is kind of difficult to see, but it's showing the percent of land devoted to each crop by county. And so each county in the United States is shaded a color based on what percent of the land in that county is used to grow these crops. And so it also paints a similar picture, but this one kind of gives you an idea on what's grown where. We get wheat growing a little further out west, where our soybeans and corn are kind of grown in this middle region here. Along the Mississippi, we get a lot of soybeans grown. There's some sugar cane and fruits and nuts grown down here in South Florida. But it's just another graph to kind of be aware of what's grown where in the United States. And that's actually where we're going to end with this video. So thank you for watching. Please take the time to bring some notes and be ready to discuss in class tomorrow. Thank you.